It's 10 times the terror.
Hello there. Getting old and senile.
Hi, and welcome once again to 10 Times the Terror. My name is Ralph.
And I'm Paul.
And Paul, would you introduce our guest?
Yes, we are very excited to have with us today Constantine Nasr, who is a producer, a writer, a critic, a film scholar, an expert in horror films, among other pursuits. And so, Constantine, it is a real privilege to have you with us. We got a lot of things we'd like to ask you. We could be talking to you for the next 3 weeks, I'm sure, with all the.
I can't do 3 weeks. I'm sorry. I have to be somewhere.
We'll bail it out with 2. Let me start. We circulated some questions before. Here's some things I'd like to get your input on, Constantine. The first one basically is this: why do horror films continue to maintain their popularity and interest when other film genres come and go? You think of westerns or musicals or even gangster films. And yet the horror film has been a staple since 1910 when Thomas Edison did the first version of Frankenstein and shows no signs of letting up. Quiet Place Part 2 just opened yesterday, continuing one of the, I think, more intriguing horror sci-fi films of the 21st century. I'd like to have your thoughts on why does the horror film continue to persist over time?
Well, thank you very much, both Paul and Ralph, for having me on the show. That's a loaded question, but I think it's actually very simple to answer, at least in my mind, and that is because we are all constantly afraid. I think, you could say we're constantly afraid of, the obvious answer is death or the unknown, but I think everybody has innate fears that they've grown up, fears that, and this is where I believe, the longevity of the horror film allows it to be fruitful in its transformation, is that we're all afraid of something different, and everybody's life experiences allow that fear to become their own monster, whether it's a monster within themselves or the monster of the oppression or the monster of nature. I mean, I'm sitting here in my house, but there was a fire 2 weeks ago that almost forced us out to evacuate. So there's so many different ways to look at it, and as much as I love all the other genres that you mentioned, I do still feel like, to some degree, the Western was more relevant at a time when we were closer to that period. And I think people could either relate in their own life, fighting forces of not the unknown, but let's say the uninhabited or the wilderness, man versus something else. In fact, I'm kind of surprised there's not as many Westerns as there should be, beyond like the handful we know, or Near Dark, or even Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But I do think that the horror film genre won't go away because we're never going to stop being afraid. That's my easy answer.
Okay. You recently worked on restoring 2 early horror film classics of the early 30s, color films, Dr. X and The Mystery of the Wax Museum, in Blu-ray, gorgeous reconstructions. Why do you think those 2 films are so important? That obviously a lot of work went into the renovation, especially with the color, and you were overseeing a lot of that. What is it about those 2 films that merits they're like putting them in a more permanent format?
Well, first I would commend UCLA and Warner Brothers, and I mean particularly people like Scott McQueen, who actually did lead the restoration on both films at UCLA Film and Television Archive, and and the Film Foundation and George Lucas, the George Lucas Foundation, all these entities came together to work on the restoration of two movies that have been, maligned is not the word, forgotten isn't it? It's just that they were out of circulation, unavailable. Some in the case of like Mystery of the Wax Museum, buried in a vault that was Jack Warner's vault that was fortunately discovered many decades ago, and it just took money to do the work and technology. And so particularly I hats off to Scott McQueen, who I worked with. I mean, I had no involvement in the restoration myself outside of being asked by my friend and the head of the Warner Archive, George Feltenstein, to produce some new content for the release, because that's fortunately what I've been able to do. My own particular study of the film goes back to, since my childhood, but I particularly spent time, especially in the mid-2000s, where we put Dr. X in its unrestored state on DVD in a collection I produced for Warner Brothers. And spent time actually researching it for my work on House of Wax about 10 years ago. These are films that go back to, in particular, like Mystery of the Wax Museum. It is a prime example of our fascination with, I think, death and the unknown. When you go into a wax museum and you see figures and creatures and people that you don't normally see, whether they're famous people like presidents or actors or figureheads or monsters. So Wax Museum in particular, I think, continues to resonate because they've remade it a numerous amount of times. We still like to go to wax museums, and we still like to recreate things, whether it's drawings that will come to life and the horror that could be underneath potential statue. So these films in particular were important because they were crucial parts of not only the genre and in its earliest of days, the horror film genre, which was really birthed in 1931, but it's also crucial in the history of Warner Brothers, which was a company very that really didn't care too much for the genre, explicitly didn't care, but they realized there could be money to be made, and they turned them into movies that were sort of Warner brand, sort of half comedy, half mystery, half horror, with that sort of newspaper mentality, thanks to Daryl Zanuck. And then lastly, it's these are key movies in the career of filmmaker Michael Curtiz, who would go on to make some movies like Casablanca, or you could just name Mildred Pierce, name all of his movies. Not a slouch. And these were two of his very early sound pictures. So that's the reason they were restored, and I think they look absolutely stunning. And I wish all horror movies could get this treatment, but it just takes a lot of money and a lot of time.
Yeah. Michael Curtiz is a particular favorite of mine. I did a master's thesis on him.
Wow!
And I really appreciated your comments on his heart, or the added segment about the horror films of Michael Curtiz.
Thank you.
Yeah, who's I argue was fascinated with the stories of self-sacrificing heroes or exiles who couldn't return home.
Sure.
And that was Curtiz himself, right?
Absolutely.
But, I think it's fascinating with that Curtiz would adapt himself to whatever, but he did have that strain that goes through and culminates, of course, in Casablanca. But I would regard him as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time.
Oh yeah,
and that alone merits trying to maintain any of his work.
Well, it's been fun working with those particular films and thinking about them, because we did a piece with Victoria Riskin for Mystery of the Wax Museum. We interviewed her, talking about her mother, Fay Ray, and the three films that she did with Lionel Atwill. And then, of course, you've got the Lionel Atwill and Fay Ray contribution there. I did a documentary a couple years ago on Lionel Atwill. So these these films and these personalities, I think, infuse the movie with style and substance and things that are memorable. I think they particularly Wax Museum is very crucial for the establishment of that persona that Lionel Atwill would sort of dominate in later in his career. So yeah, there's so much about those movies visually and of course the color. You haven't talked about the two-strip Technicolor. So yeah, definitely worthwhile. They are of a period, so you have to watch them with that in mind. Whereas I think, in my personal opinion, House of Wax holds up still today as a really compelling film. Wax Museum is I don't want to call it a dated movie. It certainly has that. It's a function of its time, but if you look at it with the sort of the context of the period and then all the other movies surrounding it, it is one of the greats. So again, it's like I try to qualify. If you watch The Mummy, it's compelling. If you watch a later film, and I'm talking about younger people who have maybe not seen these films, they're important, they're entertaining, and yet you just have to remember when they were made. A few years into sound, there is no score, things like that.
Yeah, and they clearly are pre-code when you have lines like "How's your sex life?"
Well, yes, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, I still think in Dr. X when the synthetic flesh finally appears and that it's a very crazy experience. And then of course you've got all kinds of obviously like sex jokes, death jokes, yeah. And everybody looks good too, and Fay Wray likes to show off her legs in ways she couldn't do a couple years later.
Yeah, we're hoping to get Victoria Riskin on our podcast here too to talk to her about Fay Wray being such a critical figure in all of this. And as you rightly say about Lionel Atwill, another film obsession of mine is Sherlock Holmes, and I actually think Lionel Atwill was the ultimate Professor Moriarty. With great lines like "Great man, Sherlock Holmes. Too bad he was honest." They
nailed it when they cast him in 39, right? 1939. Was it 39 or 40?
Well, the 39 he was in The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yeah.
But whereas Moriarty was 1942. Sherlock Holmes and The Secret Weapon. That's
right. Sorry. Okay. Sherlock Holmes, The Secret Weapon. Okay. You got to edit that one out. No, right. Now, yes. I was just thinking, like, who is my favorite? I mean, it's hard to go opposite Lionel Atwill. I think Eric Porter gives him a run for his money, but Lionel Atwill is Lionel Atwill. So, absolutely.
Yeah. Let me talk about another thing that comes up in horror film discussions, and you've covered both areas. There's the Universal films of the, I just said the classic period of the 30s and 40s, and then there's the British Hammer films of the 1950s and 60s, most of which are remakes of the Hollywood films of an earlier period. So you invite a certain kind of comparison, but by virtue of the fact it's the same storylines back and forth, most of which were from Universal. Some like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were done by other studios. How do you see the comparison between that classic Hollywood period and then the British Hammer period, especially when they're talking about Frankenstein, Dracula, the Mummy, the Werewolf, the same kind of storylines?
Well, and I'm gonna say this knowing full well you wrote an excellent book on Terence Fisher, so I will have to except we may disagree, I guess, but I don't believe that they are remakes. I mean, the only ones who could let's say qualify, I think, for remakes were when Universal and Hammer would unite and they actually had the property of the Mummy to do. I mean, everything else. Hammer was wise to just go back to the source material. I mean, Curse of Frankenstein was created primarily because they couldn't go to Universal. Universal was actually actively threatening to sue them. So Curse of Frankenstein was a result of, we're going to take the public domain novel and run with it. Dracula, I mean, they did have to work with Universal on that because Universal had the rights since 1930. But it wasn't necessarily a remake. I mean, none of those films I would look at as remakes because they were not even original on their own. I mean, they were original in their sequel form, but when you look at The Phantom of the Opera, you look at Curse of the Werewolf, which is, the Werewolf of Paris. They were, I just did a commentary on Captain Clegg, which was, and strangely, I go through that whole thing. This is in the new Indicator collection that's coming out of their Universal films. Captain Clegg wasn't even a remake of, it was a remake of the 1937 film Dr. Sin, essentially the screenplay. So my take is Hammer really reinvented the form. I mean, that's nothing new, but they did it by sourcing the original English, almost like recapturing the English mythology. That's a term everyone likes to throw around these days. But by reclaiming everything from Jekyll and Hyde to Phantom of the Opera, of course, is French, but had been embraced. I do think that they elevated what Universal did, because unfortunately Universal, for their first golden period, as much as I love them, their latter period, which we all know, ended up becoming more fun and family fare. Let's say, especially in the war years. But that was by design, and that was also because of the code. So anyway, that's how I feel about it. I think the two are very distinct. You can't do anything without Universal, and the Universal classics are both masterpieces and in many ways cannot be bettered. And I say that with all hats off to Boris Karloff or what Frederick March did, and that's not Universal, but that's my thought. How do you respond to that, Paul?
Yeah, I as you said, you very nicely mentioned my book, where I get into this, and one of the comments of my kids when I first wrote the book is they said, knowing how much you love the Universal films, it's striking to see how critical I was of them because I'm trying to lift up Terence Fisher, even vis-a-vis the Hammer milieu. But I think that from my perspective, as a minister too, I think that the faith issue, the metaphysical issues in these stories are more borne out in the Hammer treatment than they were in the Universal treatment. The Universal, though, they crossed a big divide when they made the first supernatural American horror film in Dracula. As you know, there had been horror films before that in the silent era, but they were never supernatural. Dracula is unabashedly supernatural, and shows the power of the cross, which is fundamental into all of this. But recently listened to your commentary with two other gentlemen on The Devil Rides Out, which I think is front and center in all these kind of issues. The Richard Matheson screenplay. I don't think there's anything like that in the 1930s period, even though it does deal with strong suggestions of the supernatural. A film like The Devil Rides Out, to me, stands apart from anything that had gone before it.
Yeah, I have to totally agree with you. I also think that though there's in particular with the Hammer films, the folks who made the films, whether it be the writers or the actors, and certainly Terence Fisher, whether they were, let's say, practicing Christians or not, or very vocal about it, they certainly infused their movies with the struggle of faith. And I just think that also kind of comes about post-war, where people are kind of struggling to handle and explore existential ideas, that in even in the pre-code era, my interpretation would be there just wasn't a lot of, not just time on screen to deal with these effects. I mean, I think that it's discussed. They're just not maybe so overt with their faith issues in a movie like Frankenstein, or the discussion of divided man in Jekyll and Hyde. But I think once the genre took, between 1931 and 1934, the sadistic approach on some level overtook the potential of the themes of faith. But then when you get right into the production code era, all of that gets swept away. I mean, you can't really talk about God that much in a movie made after 1934, 35. I think the code had put the handcuffs on all subjects, so it ends up becoming literally mostly about a monster and the community fighting that monster. Maybe the Wolfman deals with inner soul struggle, and there's a sense of faith I see underlying the Wolfman, but yeah, I just think there was a little bit more of the boundaries being pushed in the 50s because they could. Then certainly after in the 60s they go all out, and then ultimately the movies of the 70s, post Vietnam, change all that. So all of the discussion of faith, I think, and the Christian themes that might have been there kind of become obviously passé, even in Hammer films, when they're kind of struggling to figure out what does it all mean in the early 70s through their decline. But they're still more interesting, I think, subtextually, than most of the films all around them, is my view.
Yeah, I would. Sure. Ralph, you had some points you want to raise? We haven't heard from you.
Well, yeah, I wanted to explore this a little deeper. I know in seminary many years ago, I had 2 courses over 2 semesters on the whole subject of evil, which can be called horror in some ways, and we categorized it into 3 levels, all creating well, they all related to those 3 issues of death, darkness, depravity, all those things that are associated with horror. And the first one was human horror. I remember we discussed that, things like terrorism, war, injustice, disease, suffering, the innocent victim suffering for no explicable reason. And we said that in that kind of horror, we have some control over it. I mean, we have laws. We can try to fight injustice. We have medicine to fight disease. So in human horror, even though it's terrifying, we have some control over. We have some options. Then we discuss natural horror. This chaos that you see in creation, a tsunami or an earthquake, and those kind of issues. We have less control. I mean, whether we could ever get to the point we can stop earthquakes or whatever, but there's a horror there that it goes beyond anything that is imaginable, and we have very little control. And then, interestingly, we talked about the supernatural element of horror, which people, wrestle with. And the new term today, rather than talking about spiritual horror or supernatural horror that's creeping slowly into our science, is transdimensional. I guess you've heard that with this whole idea of the UFO phenomenon now. A lot of people are saying this is they don't want to call it spiritual. They say it's transdimensional, it has dimensional type of thing that can go from one dimension to another. Well, horror films have talked about that constantly. So my thoughts on, and of course, in that kind of an idea, on the 3rd level, is really scary, because there the ultimate horror film is where you don't have control. there's no control other than outside intervention. Demons, ghosts, Dracula, monsters, these are things that are out of control. And we've never seen, the typical statement in the trailers when we were kids is, it's like nothing we've ever seen before, and that's not a good thing. You want to see things that you can relate with, but it's pretty hard to relate with this idea of supernatural horror. Just as much as ministers, we have this horrifying image in the Bible of what's called the abyss, and you have these entities begging Jesus, do not let us go into the abyss. So, in putting it into film and so forth, when we think about horror films, I kind of come up with this idea that there are two ultimate purposes for horror films that continue to make them what they are today as popular. And the first is horror films simply as entertainment. It's like Halloween. We've turned monsters and ghouls and ghosts into something fun. But there is some degree where people need to sit back from horror and be entertained by it because they can laugh at it. They can laugh at the scariest things imaginable because in their minds, they're saying it's not real. On the other hand, they appreciate it's ironic because we appreciate horror that really does scare us into a fearful state. I mean, when we saw the movie Alien the first time, we were scared out of our wits because it really was a realistic kind of horror. And so I think that there's a place here in horror films to do both. And what's interesting to me, because I constantly get this thrown at me. Well, not so much. I'm retired now, but if there's a God who's all powerful and good, why do we have horror to begin with? Whether it's in the human sense, in the natural sense, or the supernatural sense, and I think this is where the Dracula films come in very powerfully because you don't know what real evil or horror is until you see the light. Without light, you have no way to differentiate between good or evil. And so what I tell people is, well, how would you even know that's horror? I mean, if we're just the products of random natural evolution, we should not be horrified by things that happen. We should say, well, that's life. And some people, of course, say that's life. Your father died. Well, that's life. Yeah, but that's horrible. Well, you just have to accept that. But there's something in the human psyche that says, I cannot and I refuse to accept it. And that's what I see as the light. And that's where Dracula, he thinks he can go around doing what he does. And there are people saying, this is obnoxious. You have no right to do this. And, his response would be, well, who gives you the right? I don't have the right, but there is a light that is all powerful that you need to be confronted with. So those are my thoughts,
Wow. Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of that. I know I gave you my epic resume, but what I didn't tell you is that I come from my dad's an Orthodox priest, so I've got 9 generations of Orthodox priests in my family. I've bailed on that to be associated with horror films, unfortunately, but I think it did give me a little bit of insight because I've studied theology too, and my hope is that the rather, let's say, anti-religious society that we live in, which again, to each their own, I to some degree it's anti-Christian, and I say this because I think if you don't have any kind of faith-based understanding of like where God fits in to yourself as well as to the universe, you probably have a hard time accepting evil. Yeah. Beyond man-made evil, and I do think that the fascination for me anyway with horror movies is because I've always been fascinated with the understanding of what's on the other side.
Right?
How do we understand what good is if we don't understand how to
exactly?
evil.
Exactly.
And what is evil except for, as you said, sort of the withdrawal of good and light. So I don't know. It's funny. I've never actually heard trans. Did you call it transcendental? What's it called?
Oh, what I was talking about, transdimensional.
Transdimensional. So I guess it's just another way. I still think of things in terms of spirituality. And if people have a different way of explaining it, that's fine. I just do think no matter what people say about their own particular faith, there is the unexplained. I mean, and that's not just the UFOs. I think having just recently finally gotten to watch the movie The Lighthouse, which I think is quite solid, riveting and effective horror film. I mean, it's a psychological thriller. It's a drama between two individuals. It has to do with sort of the physical challenges of Earth as the existential threat, but then also this bizarre, I don't know if you've seen it, this bizarre the spiritual or dimensional threat. Have you seen it?
I have. Yeah.
It's got crazy people. It's got man fighting man, but driven insane by either his own internal horror, external horror, and this transdimensional spiritual horror, I'd say.
And there's a sense of being trapped. The lighthouse becomes kind of a prison.
Sure.
And that carries over into a lot of other things here. Well, listen, we appreciate taking your time here, Constantine. One last question I'd like to ask our guests, especially whatever field we're looking at, in this case, horror films. Do you have a favorite horror film?
Oh, that was one that I didn't know you were going to ask me that one. Favorite horror film? I mean, it's hard because I love so many. I mean, I've been very involved with Universal horror, Hammer horror. I would say I'm not going to pick one, but I will try to recommend a couple for your listeners. And I say this because if you haven't seen any Val Lewton films, go pick up The Body Snatcher. If you haven't seen Hammer horror films, pick up The Devil Rides Out, which I think is, arguably one of Hammer's best. And perhaps I told this on the commentary. I told it to R.C. Mathis, and his dad wrote the best script Hammer ever had. And then, pick up Mystery of the Wax Museum. Just check them out. Check out why these films are out there, why they last, and the performances. I just did a commentary. I'll reveal it here on The Dead Zone, the Cronenberg movie. Excellent film. Check out The Dead Zone.
I want to ask you, Constantine, my last question. You just mentioned the commentary. How does one become a person? How do you get an opportunity to do a commentary? Is that something you went out to try to do, or do people contact you? I mean, Paul and I would love to do a film commentary. How does one do that?
All right. Well, I'm glad you tell me this. So now I've been producing DVDs and Blu-rays for 20 years now, and normally I was the commentary producer. So I would pick with the studio who we wanted to represent the movie, whether it's a filmmaker or someone who wrote a book or whatever. I got into commentaries myself as a commentator because I thought I was doing also a lot of work. And when you make 100 documentaries, you kind of know. I like to think a little bit of a thing about your subject. So I found myself, whether it's doing a Bugs Bunny commentary or a Hammer film, I've spent 25 years on the subject. If you want to do a commentary, we'll chat about it. If I'm able to have there might be an opportunity.
Okay.
I'll take you up. If I know of any Terrence Fisher films coming up, I will let you know, because that sounds about like right up your alley.
We would love that. Well, thank you so much. And
thank you very much too. I appreciate the invitation.
Okay. God bless you.
All right. Yeah. Take care.
This is 10 Times the Terror, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, I'm Ralph, and
this is Paul saying.
So
take care.
Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror.
the podcast.
You are impossible.
Ralph, you're well intentioned, but totally wrong. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.